Welcome, welcome, welcome. Part of our continuing series where we talk to scholars, professors, reporters, writers, columnists, activists, people on the left, people on the right. We don't care. We want to get quality information in full and complete thoughts from a variety of perspectives out to you, the public, because we think that it's important for you to have that. And we hope that you do something that was popular when I was in high school. It's not so popular these days anymore, but maybe we'll bring it back. It's called Think for Yourself. Maybe you've heard about it, maybe not. Maybe you need to Google that. It's okay. I understand it's not as popular this generation, but we'll see. With us today is a very distinguished guest, Professor Robert J. Lieber. He is the Emeritus Professor at Georgetown University. Robert J. Lieber is Professor Emeritus of Government and International Affairs at Georgetown University, where he previously served as chair of the Government Department and interim chair of Psychology, Government and Psychology. He is the author of 18 books on international relations and U.S. foreign policy and has been advisor to presidential campaigns, to the State Department, and to the drafters of U.S. national intelligence estimates. His latest book is Indispensable Nation: American Foreign Policy in a Turbulent World, published in 2012 by Yale University Press. His other recent books include Retreat and Its Consequences, Power and Willpower in the American Future: Why the United States is Not Destined to Decline. He's also taught at Harvard, Oxford, UC Davis, right here in California, and has been a visiting fellow on the Fondation Nationale des Sciences Politiques in Paris. I thought that was misspelled, then realized it's French.
No, it's Fondation Nationale des Sciences Politiques.
I'm not going to try because I'll butcher the language. That's beautiful, the way you said it. The Brookings Institution in Washington, the Fudan University in Shanghai, impressive. He received his undergraduate education at the University of Wisconsin and earned his PhD at Harvard. In addition, he's been a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim, Rockefeller, and Ford Foundations, Georgetown University's Career Research Achievement Award, and the Hepburn Shibusawa Distinguished Senior Leadership at the University of Tokyo. And this is a little bit of the book that just came out. I recommend everybody check it out. It's called Indispensable Nation: Americans' Foreign Policy in a Turbulent World. He's a scholar at foreign policy. These are some of the works that he's published in the past, backing up his foreign relations pedigree. And today we're going to talk about this article. But before we get to that, Professor, let me ask you, did I get anything wrong? Is there something we need to correct?
Well, you were admirably close, but since I'm a stickler for accuracy, let me just correct one or two things. This pronunciation of my last name is Lieber, not Lieber. Lots of people get it wrong. You were close. Lieber. And secondly, you referred to my having written 18 books. Actually, I've authored 10 of them, and I've edited and co-authored 8 others.
Okay. You were part of 18 books.
Fair enough.
Okay, fair enough. Well, let's get to this main thing. This is the article that I found, and it's in the book Political Polarization in American Politics, and the article is called Politics Stops at Water's Edge Not Recently. This book came out in 2015. Why were you part of this book? Why did people want to write a book in 2015? And basically, if you could come at it both as somebody who's a professional academic, but also somebody who's just an American with 2 eyeballs and was awake at this time. Mm-hmm. What's going on in 2015? Why is polarization an issue? Why write a book about it? Why have a bunch of professors come together and write chapters? What's going on? Was it an important issue at that time? In your words, Professor.
Yes, it had become an important issue by then. A group of people in American politics, including a bunch of my colleagues, had addressed this issue. And I had, although American politics is not my main field, it's international relations and American foreign policy, a lot of the work I do touches on American politics, which is inevitable if you deal with American foreign policy.
Right.
And I felt that there was a tendency here to put the blame for polarization more on Republicans than on Democrats. And I thought that, in fact, there was enough blame to go around on both sides of the political spectrum. And that, along with that, in recent years, the political science world is becoming much more of a monoculture. When I got in early on in America's academic golden age, a decade after Sputnik, I think you could say that the challenge to academic freedom was more from the right than the left. I think over the course of more than half a century, that has changed, and the challenge to academic freedom is more from the left than the right. I was an undergraduate at Wisconsin, and Wisconsin has a wonderful tradition. From the late 19th century, there is a plaque quoting from the regents of the university. It's on Bascom Hall, which is the main university building, and it has a line that about the importance of the sifting and winnowing of ideas, without which the truth cannot be discovered. And I felt in writing the piece that I did, which I think actually grew out of a conversation and friendly disagreement with colleagues and others, I could address that by saying that, yes, there's a great deal of polarization. It extends to foreign policy more so than it used to, although even foreign policy has always had a strong political element to it, but that the blame rests with both sides of the political spectrum, not primarily the Republicans.
We did an interview yesterday with Professor Lee Jussim, I think, and it's ironic because he literally said the same thing you did.
Really?
Yeah. Here's the exact quote from that interview. He was talking about how in academia there's a bias. And when we're looking at political polarization, it's an academic subject, and there seems to be a bias. And it seems to be that almost all the professors in the field are left. And he's a liberal too, but he also recognized that that's not exactly great to have a scientific field and where everybody's from one side and not from the other. And he said that begins to make people doubt the conclusions of that field and feel that the field is biased, and therefore we don't need to accept the things that those professors say. And I said, well, I'm still withholding my conclusions, but something I've noticed is, and real quick, so I've read this.
So very nice.
And we've done and we've done a lot of white papers. That's how I found you. So I'm withholding my conclusions, and I'm not saying this is a fact, but just a casual observation I've noticed is that about 90% of all the political polarization authors and books are from professors who work at a left university. They're not on the right side. And they work very hard to not announce their bias and to seem neutral, and I truly respect that. But it's kind of clear where they're coming from when you talk to them. And all of them basically say, yeah, the Democrats did some polarization, but really it's 90% the Republicans. And so I was bringing up to this professor, like, isn't that weird that we have a field where there's almost no conservative professors, and the professors in that field all come from one particular side, and 90% of them say, well, it's 90% all the Republicans' fault. And I have been around other fields. I work in climate change. I worked in transportation. I've read federal reports. You would typically announce your bias. You would say, look, our research shows X, but we have to admit that in our research of apples, all the main researchers were apple farmers. We really need to have some apple eaters do a study on apples, and we don't. And while we're not doubting the conclusions of the apple farmers, we do need to admit this bias, just being good scientists, and ask for more research. I've seen nothing like that acknowledgement at all in any of the books or any of the interviews or any of the white papers.
Now, there's some interesting questions about data. How do you, I'm not a number cruncher. I've just one refereed article that appears in a journal using quantitative data years ago. But quantitative approach to politics is not my specialty, nor is American government. But I find enough commonality to be able to weigh in on this with some sense that I know what I'm talking about. And I provided examples. Now, examples are not the same thing as data, sure enough. But in the book you cited,
Please.
I note the Gallup poll data, or the survey data. That's it. At the 2008 national political conventions, delegates were asked whether they thought the Iraq War had been a mistake or had been justified. Depends how you phrase the subject. And then the Gallup poll around that time also had numbers for the public and for people who lean Democratic or Republican. And then there were the preferences of the delegates. What struck me is only 2% of the Democrats felt the Iraq War had been justified. This is the 2003 war, even though in the votes in the House and Senate, lots and lots of Democrats voted for it. In fact, in late 2002, the majority of Senate Democrats voted for the Iraq War, including John Kerry. I'm pretty sure Joe Biden did, Hillary Clinton, and so forth. In other words, there was a lot of sense that this was justified. It was a close call. It was a judgment call. And arguably, it was probably a mistake to go ahead with the war without minimizing the threat that Saddam Hussein represented. But the costs of the war have proved to be very painful politically and in human lives and blood and treasure. But the point is that only 2% of Republican delegates, who were the activists, were for the war at that point. Whereas on the Republican convention delegates, the numbers were a little more nuanced, not quite so polarized as that. It's only one piece of information. There were a few others I cited. You can also note that in the 2000 election for president, which came down to an extremely close vote in Florida, Al Gore was defeated by George H.W. Bush by just a little over 500 votes. There were Democrats who, at the time and afterward, refused to accept that as a fact. Later on, you had Hillary in 2016 continuing years later to question the legitimacy of that vote. And Stacey Abrams in Georgia also rejecting the legitimacy of the vote, which had defeated her.
Thank you. No one ever mentions that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mention it because obviously the January 6th, 2021 assault on the Capitol was outrageous. It was an insurgency. It was a crime against the American Constitution and against the rule of law. And those who took part in it, and those who later rationalized it, and those who encouraged it, like Donald Trump, are profoundly guilty of a threat to our society and polity.
Let me stop.
My point is the blame is there's blame to go around on various sides of the political
Oh,
spectrum.
yeah. So just to back you up, I have said to many people that they go, well, because I'm a liberal. I was an ex-Republican. I got out in 2012, but I'm progressive. I know a lot of progressives, and they would say, "Well, Donald Trump denying the election, that's horrible. What a horrible monster. Who would do that?" And I go, Stacey Abrams. Who? What? Yeah, she straight up denied the election, and they had an investigation. It didn't back her up. And she said, I don't care what the investigation says. I'm still not going to believe in the election. And no one in the Democratic Party criticized her. And I think that was a year before Trump ever said, stop the steal. And I don't agree with Trump's stop the steal rhetoric, but what blew me away was that literally nobody who criticized the stop the steal rhetoric could mention that Stacey Abrams did the exact same thing a year before. It was totally polarized reporting.
Don't forget, Hillary kept on.
Oh, yeah.
I did not vote for Trump in 2016, and I did not vote for him in 2020. But Hillary kept on after 2016, years later, still questioning the validity and the legitimacy of the vote that had denied her the presidency.
And now, because of the Durham report, we know that's all a lie from what Clinton did. What Clinton said was all a lie. And as far as I can tell, nobody in the liberal side has really held her to account. I mean, the Durham report is basically suggesting that she co-opted aspects of the domestic security state in order to go after a political rival, and was able to co-opt members of the domestic security state and members of the media and members of the politics. And they literally did what they knew was a lie for 4 years. Now it all comes out. Most liberals aren't aware of that report, or they don't care, or they don't buy what it says. And Hillary Clinton's basically been able to just deny the report and act like it's just kind of garbage. And so she's gotten off without any introspection. And I'm wondering, what kind of country can we have, and can we get to where we have leaders held to account when you have a system where, okay, if that guy denies the election, he goes down. But if people on our side deny the election, we'll say nothing. Is that a functional, stable country?
That's the kind of thing I have in mind. In other words, there's a lot of sophisticated data about attitudes in public opinion surveys and so forth. And some very thoughtful political scientists will use it to argue that there is the tendency toward polarization, according to them, is greater on the right than on the left. There are differences here of nuance. It may well be that the tendency is stronger on the right than left, but the evidence is not overwhelming. And the other point is that politics is not beanbag. Harry Truman once said about politics, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Politics in America is a contact sport. And there's a lot of rough and tumble. A lot of it can be hard-edged and so forth. But you have to have some sense of what the practical political world is like, but also about what the tacit understandings are about politics. And I think in that sense, our political life in America has become much more bitter. And you can see it in the differences within the Congress. It used to be that in the Senate, for instance, senators of both parties were friendly. They would drink together. They would play poker together, things like that. I suspect they don't have time for that kind of thing these days. But you have a sense that a lot of the personal relationships are not what they were. And it's also the case that sociological changes in our country and other changes that modernity has brought about has also fostered polarization. That the importance of primaries and the way redistricting in which both parties, when they have control of the state, will play games with the boundaries of congressional borders, will create a situation where a lot of candidates for office, at least for the House of Representatives, will, instead of looking to moderates and the center for votes, will worry about their right or left flanks for fear that if they don't satisfy the more hardline, even extreme elements in their party, they may have a primary challenge from somebody who claims to be more pure. I think there's rather more of it now than there used to be, and that's got to be a factor as well.
Let me ask you, I want a couple of questions, but first off, you have been around a while. When did it get bad? When did you notice it get bad? And not just as an academic, just as somebody who's been alive for a while. Do you have a couple memories or points that you could share with us, the audience, where you go, I remember seeing this and going, we didn't used to do that. That's noticeably worse than before. Did it all start with Trump, as liberals say, or was there some polarization before Trump? If so, how far back does it go?
It's worsened noticeably with Trump, but it goes farther back in many respects. Um, it's hard to know when to start exactly. As I've said, American politics has always had a rough edge to it. And for example, one of the books you may have read is the one about the paranoid style in American politics. There
I've
was
heard
the
of
Red
that.
there was the Red Scare after World War II, in which a kind of frenzy about looking for communist sympathizers and actual communists, and the McCarthy hearings, the House Un-American Activities, and so forth. Now, it was true that there had been communist infiltration in the United States in the years running up to World War II and in the atomic weapons project. But by the time the Red Scare was reaching full flower in the years after World War II and into the early 1950s, the communist espionage had by and large been rolled up. So there was a tendency to tar progressives and people who were nonconformists with arguments that they were subversives or communists or whatever.
Yep.
There was an active communist party, and people. Communism represented a threat in the sense that if you look at the communist countries, they were brutal dictatorships. But the Communist Party of the United States after World War II was not a threat to the United States. It was marginalized. Then later on, the Vietnam War saw a great deal of political anger generated about that conflict. Civil rights, especially in the South, at times led to violent repression. But more recently, it's hard to know exactly when to pinpoint it. The Democrats had controlled the House of Representatives for most of the time from the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932 until the later in the 1950s or even 60s, with rare exceptions. And when under Bill Clinton, I think after 2 years in office, which would have been 1994, the Republicans gained a decisive advantage in Congress with Newt Gingrich as the speaker. You sensed a hardening of political polarization on both sides. Many Democrats felt as though the House of Representatives was the people's house and rightfully belonged to them. Republicans, I think, probably thought that they wanted to get revenge for all these years in the wilderness. Since then, control of the presidencies especially seesawed back and forth, although Democrats have generally done a little better with the House, with the Senate being more or less split back and forth. That's some of it. The frenzy over Bill Clinton's impeachment in the Monica Lewinsky affair at the end of his term in the late 90s was also a source of political bitterness, going beyond some of the normal rules of the game. But the marginalization of someone like Joe Lieberman, who was a moderate Democrat, who was close with a couple of key Republican senators, including John McCain. And Joe Lieberman was even the vice presidential nominee under Al Gore in the 2000 election.
Right.
Yet Lieberman was challenged from his left in a Senate primary in Connecticut by a more liberal Democrat. He lost the primary but ran as an independent and won the seat. But after his term was up, his political career was over. The fact that there was no space in the Democratic Party for a Joe Lieberman, that he'd become marginalized, I think says something about the atmosphere of the party. On the other hand, the days of moderate Republicans, think of the Bushes, especially Bush the elder and Bush the younger, or Dwight Eisenhower even. Those days seem to be, at least for now, gone, or a memory of the past. So both parties, I think, speaking impressionistically, have been subject to a toughening, a hardening of views and more polarization. Fewer moderates, and there are some in both parties, but by and large, a growing antagonism of the parties toward each other, and a growing strengthening of the more purist wings of both parties.
We had heard from other people that there's debates. Does polarization go back to 2010, 2000, 1992, or even the late 1970s? A lot of people are, and I'm kind of sort of gearing this way, that it goes back to 1990s. One thing that people point out is Newt Gingrich, and that he came in and there was a policy of, we may argue as different party people in public, on TV, and that's our job. We're supposed to represent our side. But in the evening, we can have dinner and drinks. And Newt Gingrich came in and he said, no more hanging out with the other party, period. That ends. And a behavior pattern that had existed for a century was wiped out. And it had to at least be some sort of, that couldn't have helped, right? That couldn't have helped. Yeah, so it was interesting you brought that up. I wanted to see where you were coming, and what you said backed up with what a lot of other people said. Let me ask you another question about this. I do want to ask you about January 6th, but let me ask you this. There is a debate amongst professors who are studying political polarization, and it goes something like this. Elites at the social media company, they benefit from having these algorithms that pit people against each other. CEOs at news corporations benefit from having extreme politicians make a statement. Extreme politicians benefit from going on TV and social media and saying extreme things. None of that means the American people themselves are polarized. This is just the elites. The American people aren't polarized at all. They love each other, and they all agree basically on the same direction for America. And so when we're talking about political polarization, it's really just the media and social media and political elites. And we can't really say that the people themselves are polarized. Does that seem reasonable, or would
it's partially true?
How
in
so?
The sense that opinion polls, I don't have an opinion poll in front of me, although I refer to some of this evidence in the book that I published last September, Indispensable Nation, in chapter 6, where I talk about the problem of the social and political and cultural underlay and the effect it has on making it difficult to organize and pursue a coherent foreign policy in which the U.S. can exercise the kind of necessary leadership in the world that I believe its national interests require. But the evidence in polling has been that public views on a lot of issues are somewhat less polarized among the general public than they are among those who lean Democratic or lean Republican versus those who are activists and voters in both parties. So yeah, there's something to that. On the other hand, there has been a phenomenon of there's a phenomenon in which the politics become much more hard-edged thanks to sorting. By sorting, I mean that a lot of the institutions that brought different types of people together have weakened. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, urban public schools, the draft, which ended in 1973, and so forth. In the America I grew up in, it was assumed that in your experiences as a youth and young adult, you would rub elbows with people very different from you, different races, religions, social classes, economic brackets, and so forth. I think you see less and less of this today than used to be the case. Further, you can see it in neighborhoods. You can see it in the magazines and newspapers and media and TV channels and streaming channels that people tune to. MSNBC versus Fox, for instance, would be one example of that. But that kind of sorting matters, as does gerrymandering of congressional districts, which I referred to a few minutes ago as encouraged by, the gerrymandering itself, which the courts have held is largely, from time, usually they declare it as a political question they don't want to touch.
Right.
Where gerrymandering has occurred in California, where the Democrats have got control of the legislature, on the one hand, or in Texas or Florida, where Republicans do, you see each party working to its advantage. Maryland would be another example of Democratic dominance shaping who gets these congressional seats, and the concern of delegates not to be out purified, if you like, outbid by those to their left if you're a Dem, or right if you're a Republican.
Sure. I want to come back to this question on, is it the people or the elites? Because you're familiar with the question. And then I want to go back to the big sword. I'm glad that you're aware of the big sword. But I find it interesting that we could have January 6th with thousands of people going to the Capitol. We could have the Stop the Steal with millions of Americans believing in it. We could have, the Republican Party originally criticized January 6th, but then they backed away from it. And then
Right.
they had the support of the people. And then we had polls like this. This came out September 30th, 2021. It's from the University of Virginia, Sabato Cristobal Center for Politics, a fairly reputable university. And the survey shows this. 74% of Biden voters and 78% of Trump voters feel voters, not elected officials, voters from the other party are, quote, a clear and present danger to the USA. I shortened the word to danger there, but it was the phrase used in the survey was clear and present danger, a phrase typically used for an ISIS attack or perhaps a Russian nuclear strike. That's
deeply disturbing. It's the Virginia outfit. It's a reputable outfit. You have to take what they found seriously.
Okay. We also have polls showing that people will not date outside their party, that you can go back 10 years ago and it was about 25-30% of the American electorate would do that. Now we're over half. A majority of Americans would say, hell no, you're related to me, you're my daughter, my son, you don't date outside our party.
In chapter 6 of my book, I go into some of that, quoting some of the polls. So it's not only the outfit at UVA that's got data like
Sure.
that, but they have data on would you want your daughter or son to marry somebody of the opposite political party?
Right.
And it's really shocking that that's the case, not least at a time when views about would you be concerned if they married somebody of another ethnicity or religion or race?
That's dropped.
Those views have liberalized enormously over the course of 3/4 of a century, and to America's credit. But the kind of numbers you just put up are shocking, and they are a real problem. And there's both cause and effect going on here. Let me give you an example. Views about supporting the war in Ukraine, supporting the Ukrainian people after this basically outrageous assault by Russia against Ukraine, which violates the UN Charter blatantly. It violates virtually every signed agreement the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation ever made. It's impossible to justify, and it's been full of crimes against humanity, war crimes, and even arguably instances of genocide. And yet you have a situation where initially the American people and those of both party preferences were largely favorable to aiding the Ukrainians. Now, the opinion among Republicans is split closer to 50-50. And I would argue that a lot of that is driven by elites and opinion leaders. The Biden administration, a Democrat, liberal Democrat, was in office when this happened, and Biden, to his credit, provided U.S. backing for the Ukrainians. Not enough, in my judgment, but without it, the Ukrainians would have been destroyed. But because he's a Democrat and holds the presidency, party elites, some of the public intellectuals associated with the party, turned against it. And a lot of people take their cues from political and cultural elites with whom they identify. So some of it is a case of public opinion among those who belong, in this case, to the Republican Party, who favor it, being shaped what their leaders think. If there'd been a Republican president in office, let's say Trump or a George Bush had supported Ukraine here, it's at least imaginable that Democrats would have started to turn against it, with progressives saying, we ought to spend this money at home. Come home, America, which was George McGovern's phrase in 1972 when Richard Nixon was president and we were still fighting the war in Vietnam.
Which we definitely did not do. I remember the two key votes for money going to Ukraine. They did a $40 billion spending package for Ukraine, and on the same day they voted down $40 billion for small business people who had been destroyed during COVID. I also remember the second $1 billion package, and it was the day after the Biden administration said, we're not going to provide additional funds for our active duty military. They can all go on welfare. So yeah, definitely. We absolutely showed that we are not going to take care of our domestic population when it comes to choosing and which one we'll choose. I want to go back to the main question though. Is it the people or is it the elites? Yes, the elites do things and people take props from them. I absolutely agree. And let's take a look at the Iraq war, the Ukrainian war. They did suggestions and people acted respondingly. But over half the population says, I won't date someone outside of my party. And 3/4 of both sides say, screw you to the other party. Is that all just elite signaling, or is there some hate that has been personally absorbed by 200 to 300 million people that isn't just responsive to elite tinkering?
There are feedback loops. That is, sometimes the elites take cue from where their audiences or where they think public opinion lies. At other times, they overshoot. For example, there's some evidence, take the highly sensitive question of abortion rights. There's some evidence that in a number of state legislatures that have taken very extreme positions, outlawing abortion altogether, or in the case of Florida, eliminating to the first 6 weeks when some women won't even know they're pregnant at the time. There's a good deal of evidence that the mainstream, even of relatively conservative Republicans, thinks that, laws about abortion ought to be tighter, that they'd be willing to support a 12 or 16 week limit, with exceptions for rape and incest, rather than something more open-ended. And in this case, some of the party elites have shifted well beyond their constituencies. On other occasions, you get the sense that the elites are following cues of where the public is, and so on. So sometimes you get feedback. Sometimes, certainly plenty of times, people taking cues from the political leaders they identify with, particularly if you have a party, you have a president of your own party, or you have a governor of your own party. Other times, the other way around, with political leaders trying to get a sense of where the public is, and then altering their views to cater to that. So
it's not just fair to say it only goes one way. The elites signal and the public do what they say.
I would say that there's a greater tendency of people to take cues from political elites. In other words, Not everybody follows the war in Iraq every day or the fine points of arguments about abortion. Just pick two important issues today.
Mm-hmm.
So they take cues from thought leaders, newspapers, journals, and so forth. There's one other point I'll come back to when I referred to a situation in the past where there was less polarization. It used to be that newspapers and TV stations had a more limited range of views. That is to say, there were 3 or 4 major TV networks, the big 3 networks, and then PBS. And among newspapers in the major cities, often there were 2 or 3 or 4 newspapers. And in both cases, the news would be filtered through the editors, tending to screen out stuff from the lunatic fringes, if you like. Now what happens is that with the breakthrough of social media and the digital world and all that, the collapse of the economics of newspapers, particularly afternoon papers, but not only, streaming channels on TV, and all the rest of it, people can take their cues from news sources or information sources, which are unmediated, which are freer to put out not only unmodified views, but sometimes stuff that's really Looney Tunes. I'll give you one example. I don't mean to beat up on Fox TV because I think their regular news coverage is pretty good. Not the opinion stuff, but the news coverage. And yet last night, Bret Baier was, I think, had to, or nonetheless, spent a little time referring to a revelation. Some guy who used to be in intelligence years ago now says that for many years, the feds have been concealing information about extraterrestrial spacecraft and even beings that have been discovered and hidden from the public. That's Looney Tunes, as is the anti-vax stuff. But with the proliferation of these different media things, unfiltered, more attention gets driven to some of these really extreme points of view, and they get out there without filtering.
Like how we heard 19 different intelligence agencies all said that Hunter Biden's laptop is a setup from the Russian government, and that turned out to be completely untrue, and no news agency.
You're absolutely right on that one, by the way. That's where mainstream.
That's also another example. Okay.
Oh, you're absolutely right to cite that.
Fact checkers fail, huh?
Big time. And winnowing of ideas comes into play. It's outrageous that what turns out to be, from all we can tell, a credible and factual story was marginalized on the basis of the arguments you cited. Also, let me say that Bret Baier, to his credit, did interview a member of Congress from the Intelligence Committee who said the bit about extraterrestrials was simply untrue. So that came later. But by airing the stuff, you get people who say, and so on and so forth. It's not the case.
So once it's out there, it's too late.
Once it's out there, and the stuff gets more of an airing now than it would have had in the past. And that's also true of really ugly stuff about race, anti-Semitism, conspiracy theories, and so forth, can emerge less diluted than they would have in the past.
So I just want to come back to this. It sounds like what you're saying is that, yes, people take cues from the elites, but sometimes the elites take cues from the lay public.
Sometimes.
Okay. And so we have this feedback loop. So it's not fair to say it's just the elites going to the public. Sometimes the public feeds into the elites. Again, you need some degree of nuance. Sure.
Broadly speaking, the public does take their cues, especially on more detailed subjects, from policy and political and cultural elites. But it's also true that to a lesser extent, there's a feedback loop. So yes, both, but more emphasis on the one than the other.
Okay. how I guess the issue that I'm struggling with is nobody said don't date people in the other party. Nobody said view everyone in the other party as the same as a Russian nuclear strike. And yet people did that on their own. There isn't any elites who said that. They may have talked in manners that might suggest that attitude, but this is an interpretation of the public. At some point, isn't it fair to say that how do you get to where half the public says, I won't date outside my party, and we can say that people aren't polarized themselves? I struggle to understand how those two facts can exist.
I don't know if it's still half the public, but certainly significant elements of the public have that view. I think that's dangerous. It reflects a level of intolerance and partisanship and even fanaticism that's politically unhealthy.
According to Time Magazine, it's over half. I'll just leave it
Wow.
there. Okay. At some point, don't we have to say that people are polarized themselves? I mean, they're really taking us on to the next level on their own. I mean, there's huge numbers. We're about 300 million people in America, and we're talking about how over half of the registered voters are saying, I don't want to have anything to do with someone in the other party.
Yeah, it's 330 million, but the point is correct.
Right. So can we blame all that on some elites telling them what to do when no elite said don't date outside?
Not on that one. It's a result of the phenomena we've talked about. Now, let me say what some of this is driven by. We've talked about many of the causes, but something else has gone on. If you ask, what are the sources of populism? And I think there were two things at work in the 2016 election. I think they're still present in significant measure. The admission of China to the World Trade Organization at the beginning of the 21st century, and competition against American workers from much lower paid foreign workers, especially in Asia, most notably in China, but other places too, as well as advances in technology, meant that a lot of people who had blue collar jobs and could with only a high school degree, nonetheless get a reasonably secure job in a factory or a large organization with enough of a salary to be able to afford to get married, have a house, have kids, take vacations, and even have a decent, though by no means luxurious, retirement. Those kinds of stable employment situations have been severely undercut in the last generation from what they used to be. And a lot of smaller and medium-sized cities, especially in the American heartland, have been gravely affected by that. And I think some of the phenomenon you see of people leading lives of sort of quiet desperation, drunkenness, family abuse, drug use in particular, suicides, gun violence, are partly a product of that. It's not exclusively the cause. And technology is also going on here too. It used to be that you would need a certain number of steel workers to produce 1 million tons of steel. Now the number of workers you need to do that, with the introduction of electric furnaces compared to the open hearth system, has dropped the number of steel workers required for a fixed amount of steel by about 90%. So it's not all due to the Chinese and so on, but the foreign competition exposed U.S. industrial workers and blue collar workers to competition from 1 billion or more foreign workers who were without the kind of Social Security protections and wage coverage and the rest here, and it made those workers very cheap. When was the last time you got an object in the mail or at a store or from Amazon that didn't say made in China on the back? You know, there's been a reaction against that, rightfully, in the last couple of years. And there's been some effort to reindustrialize, especially in extremely important high-tech sectors. And Congress has acted and so forth. But it's a long slog, and that's been in effect. So one of the two great factors pushing populism, it's kind of a popular rage against the elites. Why did they let this happen? Even though a lot of this had to do with trends that people weren't aware of or couldn't do much about. Second factor, a sense of disparagement. Many of the elite media have pushed, and elite politicians and progressive politicians have pushed cultural notions far harder than much of the public is willing to readily accept when it comes to sex and gender and identity. So an example would be a moderate 50-ish, let's take a 50-ish woman in a medium-sized city in Wisconsin who thinks she's reasonably moderate, who doesn't think Black people should be discriminated against, who consider themselves open-minded, nonetheless is appalled at the idea that a guy who's born biologically male, with all the male biological
transgender story time for kids. Is that where we're going?
Well, thinks he's a woman and should be allowed to be in an adolescent girl's bathroom or dressing room, say as an athlete or whatever.
Or launch a national beer campaign, right?
That's right. And so there's been a lot of reaction because views about the family, religion, sex, gender, and so on that have been pushed hard in recent years by progressives have run into bitter opposition. And the people who hold, let's call them more traditional views, say about marriage or the family or religion, feel that the elites are marginalizing them and treating them not just as people who disagree, but people who are wrong or stupid or even evil. And so that sense of cultural disparagement is hard to quantify, but I think that exists together with this problem of sociological and economic and industrial change that I've referred to. And those two things together drive a good deal of that polarization and populism in particular, and also the hard-edged nature of it on both sides of the political spectrum.
I want to ask you a question if I may. So a lot of people have compared now to the 1960s. They said polarization is bad now, but the 1960s was worse. It was more violent. People were shot, blown up, Kent State massacre, etc. However, I've heard something that I found a little disturbing. Some professors would say, you're right. 1960s was a lot more violent, but it's worse now for this reason. In the 1960s, people believed in the authority of Congress. They respected the ability of the Supreme Court to set laws. They respected that if Richard Nixon won the election, well, I may not like him, but he won. They didn't spend 4 years saying, I'm going to doubt that your guy won the election. Oh, yeah, well, now I'm going to spend the next 4 years doubting your guy's going to win the election. I don't like what that Supreme Court decision says. I'll go on TV as governor or lieutenant governor and say I will ignore or defy the court, or I'll go on TV and say ignore the Supreme Court rulings. Who cares? Let's just ignore them. We also have the lowest faith of every form of the federal government in 40 years, except the military. And what I hear from people is, as bad as it got in the 1960s, there were common institutions and everybody believed in them. And now we don't have anything like that. Thoughts, feelings, Professor?
I agree with that. It's very disturbing and it's true. And this relates in part to what I said about common experiences that people had. It used to be that young men expected they would have to go into the military, that they would be drafted, or if they weren't, or unless they enlisted or were in ROTC or whatever. And they had these other experiences in the public schools and elsewhere that brought them into contact with others of different makeups. But certainly the legitimacy of the Congress, the presidency, the Supreme Court, the court system generally has become an issue, which I think is dangerous. And that's a product of the temper of the times in a way, and it's more extreme now than things were then. Also, note something I find very disturbing on both sides of the political spectrum. which is to say, I think the January 6th attack on the Capitol was outrageous, and an attack on our constitutional system, our politics. It was subversive. It was an insurgency.
I want to ask you that. So you are.
I want to make, it's a broad point. So that's on the one side. On the other side, let's not forget that after the George Floyd dying at the hands of police, that the Black Lives Matter and others were involved in urban riots that sometimes burn out portions of central cities, especially small businesses. And there was a tendency on the left, and even among authorities in some communities, to let that play out and not condemn it the way it should have been. In other words, civilization requires a degree of, law and order, and even a certain degree of consensus in society. And the necessary comity, the necessary sense of shared identity, and acceptance of institutions and so forth, is essential. And on both sides of the political spectrum, it's been increasingly challenged. And in some of the broad data of the sort you've recently referred to here, it's under threat. And I think that is a newer, more dangerous element in terms of where we stand now.
I like the comparison. George Floyd should not have been killed. He was executed. But 22 cities didn't need to go up in fire. And you hadn't seen that many cities on fire since, I believe, the assassination of Martin Luther King. It was definitely a low point. And I did notice that it was bizarre because conservatives were going, there's 22 cities on fire. And yet when I talked to liberals, they had like almost no idea that was going on. They're like, what?
I think we referred to them. I mean, you had one case, the media referring to quote unquote, mostly peaceful protests.
Right. So
central cities were sometimes on fire, or even here, I live in Washington. You could drive to even parts of DC, which are otherwise pretty quiet and even upper middle class. Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown, where store windows were broken into, and so on and so forth. Not as violent as in some areas like Seattle and I don't know where else, but the nonetheless, this phenomenon of outright lawlessness and anarchy was deeply disturbing, and one side of the political spectrum just winked at it.
22 cities on fire in the past would have gotten a president to come on TV and address the nation. We got nothing. Right. At the same time, January 6th was an insurgency, and you're a foreign policy scholar, and you would be able to say that. I wanted to focus on that because I've met people who go, it wasn't an insurgency, it wasn't a coup, it was like a barbecue that got out of hand. And I'm like, that is not what people who study foreign policy and coups in the rest of the modern world are saying. I see a lot of Americans saying it's not a coup, and I go, how come everybody on the rest of the planet disagrees with you? Like all our European allies, everybody who studies foreign policy in reasonable countries is all going, yeah, that was a coup. And yet when we come to America, Americans still debate it. Most of the modern world has no debate on what happened on January 6th.
It was a coup attempt. And there's a lot of blame to go around.
Sure.
One question I've never found addressed is why weren't the police and especially the military, or at least the National Guard there, in larger numbers sooner? I mean, the police who were there acted valiantly and courageously, and many of them paid a terrible personal price in terms of injuries or worse. But the fact that under the circumstances when it looked like something dangerous was brewing, the fact that better protection was not afforded to the Capitol was a mystery.
That was the Democrats' decision, by the way. That was Pelosi and her ilk, and they didn't want to do it because they felt it would give a bad image. And yet, for the past 3 years, they were talking about how Donald Trump's an existential threat. And yet, on the day that we have January 6th, they seem to have dropped all their security concerns. It was quite bizarre to, for years, say, existential threat, America threat democracy, all hands on deck, it's all over. And then you have warnings that something's going to pop off, and you go, yeah, we don't need to really have security.
I think you're
bizarre, right?
You're absolutely right about that.
Not do it the day of.
once more blame. You're absolutely right about that. But it's
Lieber.
also the case that when you read some of what happened, that the DOD had to authorize the sending of troops. There was an issue about who authorized the National Guard and how, and some of that got slow walked in a way that was disgraceful. And it's hard to know whether it was a matter of ineptitude or deliberate holding back. In either case, there's plenty of blame.
Military always has a clear line of authority. So if somebody's acting like we're not clear, that's the politicians. I'm not in the military, but all my family was, and that is how that works. So I look at the politicians going, we're not sure who said it. That's not the military. One thing I wanted to point out was I felt like on January 6th and with the BLM riots with 22 cities, I've talked to people who were involved in both. And I felt like neither one of them could take responsibility for their actions. So, for example, January 6th, I've talked to conservatives who said all of the violence was by secret Antifa who dressed up like conservatives and caused it. No actual conservatives did the violence. It's all Antifa spies. It's all their fault. We did nothing wrong. I've heard that from many conservatives. Flip it to the other side. No BLM protester smashed a window or set fire to anything. It was all the Proud Boys and the police pretending to be BLM who did that. Nobody in BLM did it. And I go, isn't this interesting that on the right, not one of us did it? All of us are innocent angels. It was evil people who came in. Flip it over to the left. Not one of us did it. It was all evil people who came in. We have two sides where nobody can take responsibility. I mean, this is ridiculous. Nobody was there to storm the Capitol. Not one person. Nobody set fire to a city. Not one person. That's impossible to say when you're looking at protests at this size. And yet we had leaders on both sides say this, and both would not condemn anything bad on their side. How are we not a nation of children? Stories?
You're absolutely right to cite those things. These are examples of outrageous conspiracy theorists on both left and right. Both attitudes, both statements, both claims are outrageous falsehoods. And the fact they could be uttered and pronounced by people should be an embarrassment to them. But those are fraudulent claims and necessarily need to be debunked.
I hear people on the left saying, look at all these people on the right, and they're saying Antifa, and that's ridiculous. And they'll never bring up the BLM thing. And then I see people on the right, they won't recognize it. The left will not recognize that even if it was a mostly peaceful protest, some people protesting for BLM set fires. It had to happen, at least a couple. You can't have 22 cities on fire and everybody was an angel. Same thing with January 6th. I get that thousands of people went there and they were probably not interested in storming the Capitol. They wanted to go to a protest and be heard. But at least a couple hundred of them had to have some idea of what was going on and then just get swept up in the moment. And what I see is groups of thousands of adults, and not one person can take any level of responsibility at all. How are we not at a total childlike conversation as adults at a population of 300 million?
You have two examples of mob violence. Both of the categories that you've referred to have to do with instances of despicable mob violence. And those engaged in them, those who support them, are using conspiracy theories and falsehoods to justify or explain or minimize the appalling nature of those acts.
Yeah, I just found it sad that nobody could say, hey, look, I'm a Republican. I get this isn't popular, but some of us were meaning to do it. Hey, I'm BLM. I totally believe the police need reform.
Well, not everybody on the right is so idiotic as to claim that it was Antifa. Not everybody on the left is so stupid or fatuous to claim that it was all Proud Boys.
True, but a lot of them do.
Plenty of people on both sides of the political spectrum who see it clear and have said so. But it can be it can be unpopular in certain circles to express those views loudly and accurately.
Let me ask you about the big sort. We were talking about sorting. Have you heard of the big sort?
Of course. Bob Putnam wrote a terrific book years ago called Bowling Alone. He followed it up with another study years later, but the argument was that Americans, and this goes back to the analysis of people like Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s,
Amen.
that Americans are fond of joining all kinds of informal and voluntary organizations, not government-led, but socially based, dealing with all kinds of issues and activities and enterprises of interest to people themselves, and they self-organize and so forth. And it was bowling leagues that Putnam was looking at. But again, scouting, Rotary clubs, other kinds of informal gatherings across the political spectrum were very, very common in the past. A lot of that activity has dried up, partly for reasons of, for lots of reasons. Life is faster paced. There's more sorting. You don't know what's the causal mechanism. The suburbs have become more important. They're farther out. They have less good public transportation. There are all kinds of possible explanations, but it is an issue that we are no longer so communally involved in these common institutions with others as we used to be. If they haven't wholly disappeared, in a later book by Putnam and a co-author tried to identify some of those things going on, but it is an issue.
I remember that I was a boy in high school, and I remember President Clinton running for office, and he was talking about bowling alone. And people thought it was weird that this presidential candidate was jumping up and down about some book. 30 years later, it makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying anything other than maybe Clinton was aware of where we were going. May I show you a map and ask you a question, Professor?
Sure.
Okay. So this is from the New York Times. It came out in 2016. It basically is backing up Bill Bishop's claim on the big sort. Bishop came out with that book in roughly, I think, the 90s or early 2000s. This is coming out almost 20 years later, and it's saying still true. By the way, the big sort was corroborated by NPR, who did reporting over 15 years saying it's true, and by 538. Here's the maps I wanted to show you. These from the New York Times. Top left. I know it's hard to see, but we're going to go off color patterns. So the top left map, very top and to the left, red, these are elections by county. So it's a very detailed map by county for presidential elections in 1992. I'm not going to ask you for super detailed questions, just roughly color patterns. Red means don't run here. If you're not a Republican, you have no chance of winning. Republicans win by 20 percentage points over Democrats here. It's called a landslide election county. This was big in the big sort. Blue means don't even run here. If you're not a Democrat, you have no chance of winning. 20 Democrats win. Gray means competitive. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we vote for McCain. Sometimes we vote for Obama. And you can go from 1992 all the way to the right at the top row to 2000. And then the middle row is 2004 to 2012. And then at the bottom, the really big map is 2016. So if you look at the map in the top left and then compare it to the map at the very bottom, what you can see is almost all the gray has been wiped out, and there's no competitive elections, and we have almost only landslide elections for red or blue, and this has happened over 30 years. And what it shows is demographic sorting by the public. I've had some professors look at this map and do this. I reject your map. Is this true? Is this not true? What should someone of the public
The map is true. How can you, it's absurd to say I reject your map. It's like saying I reject reality. The reality is
who did it that
the politics in many states is less competitive. California being a case in point.
Fair.
Texas and California and Texas, you might say, are opposites. Or although there, it has to do with whether candidates have a chance of winning or not. It's not absolute, otherwise Congress and the Senate would never change hands. But the margin of both presidential and elections and control of the Congress is very fine-tuned. There are, instead of, there are only handfuls of states and handfuls of congressional districts and Senate seats that are really in play in each 2 or 4 year cycle. And that's what you're seeing in those charts. And there is some sorting, people moving to communities they find more comfortable in some ways. So that as you can see from the map, the 2 coasts and certain enclaves, parts of Denver and areas around there, some of the big university cities in the upper Midwest are blue, but often the countryside is red.
So it's real.
It is real.
How do we undo this? It's taken 3 decades to get here. It didn't happen overnight. It was year after year. There's some debate if people are saying, I need to move to an area where people vote like me, or if they're going off sort of a subconscious feel of, I don't feel this area reflects my values. I kind of see things or hear things and I feel this area reflects my values. I move there and then I start to vote the way my neighbors do, even if I don't necessarily have conscious conversations with them. There's some debate.
Clearly people don't like to live in a setting where they feel utterly alienated, that their views are anathematized by their neighbors. But also people don't move lightly. I mean, you're pulling up your roots and so forth. So I think what happens is it's only at the time you feel you want to move for other reasons: retirement, health, family matters. Let's say you've matured, your kids have gone somewhere and they've set up in some other state, that kind of thing, or a job offer. Then you might be more attentive to the kind of neighborhood or environment in which you settle. So there's always some fluidity in this. And occasionally a state or a constituency that seemed all red or all blue would prove not to be the case. But the pattern you've pointed to of sorting is very real, and it's become much more pronounced in the last 30 years, as the maps you've put up there indicate.
They're showing that once you go landslide, you never go back. So once you go landslide red, you're...
I'm not sure how true that is, because there are instances in which, Christie won in New Jersey. I think he may have served 2 terms, Chris Christie, who was a moderate Republican.
Right.
The current governor of Virginia is a moderate Republican, or actually a moderately conservative Republican, and won in what was increasingly a blue state, Virginia.
Right.
Florida, which was considered a purple state until very recently, in which the gubernatorial election in 2018 was extremely close when DeSantis won. DeSantis won by 20 points this last election, and he carried Miami, and he carried constituencies, congressional districts and cities that in some cases had been completely red. There, in each of these cases, there are others on various sides of the political spectrum in other states and cities, but usually there's some explanatory factor. Certainly, how constituencies handled COVID is a case in point. DeSantis, who's become a controversial figure, an important one, in challenging Trump, followed a policy of keeping the state open. Open meant businesses and schools. He was at least maybe the second state after maybe New Hampshire to open up, maybe 4 months after Trump and Fauci had closed everything on March 15th. And despite claims on the left that it resulted in huge numbers of deaths in Florida, the CDC, in their official data, adjusted for age, because Florida has an older population, finds that Florida actually ranked 35th in its age-adjusted death rate, with first being the worst, and so on. So he was in the better half of the states in terms of fatalities from COVID.
Wow.
New York State, that had complete closure, was number 17. So,
Wow.
I mean, I had this argument with people at two different dinners or receptions in the last 10 days who simply argued the opposite and were completely indifferent to the data and the facts.
Mm-hmm.
DeSantis was evil, and he had done this, and it caused many more deaths than closures had done. But the closures deprived little kids of a year or two of schooling, which has set them back intellectually, according to nationwide tests. And if you talk to any therapists who keep their eye on this, has left a lot of little kids socially maladjusted.
I hear you, but we got to stop there for the algorithms. I can't go into a big COVID thing. With respect, we got to stop there. I hear your point. I just, the algorithms. I hear you. I would say that the evidence seems to show that you might have been purple, but when you go hardcore, one big election, red or blue, it seems like you don't shift back. That's just some of it. The question I want to ask you was this. The big sort goes back to 1992. Newt Gingrich. Let's not hang out with each other.
Gingrich is 94.
94. Okay. Let's change that. Here's the question. According to political historians, this is what I found out. So social media wasn't really a big problem until maybe 2015, 2016. You can go back to 2010 if you really want to push it. Gerrymandering came out in 2000, but it really wasn't effective until the 2010 election. Extreme politicians really started to show up the last 2 years of Trump's presidency on both sides. And polarization of the news, you could go back to maybe like 2010, 2015. The big sort predates all those by 20 years. How are those the causes of polarization when people were sorting themselves well before any of those things came online?
Well, those sorts of phenomena have been occurring and growing in scope and intensity. And they became evident earlier, but what they've done is intensify. And the digital age and social media have created a means for intensifying these things and making all of them measurably worse.
Yes, I'm sorry. Just the way you said that, it caught me off guard.
Why did it catch you off guard? I would have thought what I've said is
because, like I was talking with Professor Lee Jessam yesterday, some of this stuff is so negative and so depressing. Occasionally, you got to have a laugh to keep going. That's
some of it's absolutely crazy.
That's why I'm not laughing at you or what you said. It just the irony of it caught me off guard. I apologize, Professor. No disrespect. I just,
I cited the sifting and winnowing of ideas. And also I grew up in Chicago. I was born and raised there. I haven't lived there since I went off to college, but we Chicagoans have an earthy, direct sensibility that you talk about differences, you lay them out, you argue them out, and that's an appropriate and even normal thing to do. Not, I should say, under every circumstance these days.
Fair
but so be it.
Fair enough. One thing that helped me start the series was I'm not so Marjorie Taylor Greene, and I get it. Some people don't like her. Some people like her. Some people think she's an idiot. Some people think she's a spokesperson. I get it. I'm not saying anything. But when she came out with her tweet on President's Day where she said we need to have a national divorce between the red and the blue because we can't get along, what I found interesting was I read 30 newspaper articles from mainstream newspapers the month that she said that. And they all went like this. Marjorie, you idiot. There's no polarization. What's this woman talking about? Exactly. So when that did not work and did not kill off the conversation, the next month they came out with a new headline from 30 different newspapers. And it went like this. Okay, there's polarization, but it's gerrymandering. It's social media. It's extreme politicians. And they would not mention the big sort at all. None of them. Even though they may have reported on the big sort previously, and it predates all of their other issues by 20 years. And I go, isn't that interesting? We can't acknowledge there's polarization, and then we can't acknowledge the underlying cause of polarization that goes back 20 years before everything else, even from newspapers who covered it themselves. And I go, wow, we're missing a lot here. We're missing a lot as Americans. Is a Republican from rural Nebraska, rural Mississippi, the same as a Republican who grew up and lives in downtown San Francisco, California?
Well, both of our first of all, I want to say I very much agree with the premise of what you've just said. These things are due to both contemporary circumstances, but also to very deep-seated things that have been taking place in America over a lengthy period of time. But both political parties traditionally have been big umbrellas, big wide umbrellas, grouping people who in a multi-party system would belong to different political parties. If you
Sure.
see in many European countries today. And so it's not surprising if people with very different backgrounds, sociological experiences, geography, personal identities, and so on, even in the same party, have very different points of view. But in both parties, there's an unhealthy tendency to push party orthodoxy in a way that makes it harder for moderates and people who think it's desirable to reach across to the other side to get things done can operate. That's dangerous. And that's why I cited early in our conversation that I thought it was disgraceful that Joe Lieberman, among a moderate Democrat, had become a pariah within the Democratic Party, just as to some constituencies among Republicans, Mitt Romney or either of the two Bushes, are frowned upon or simply ignored. Even Ronald Reagan gets underemphasized or ignored in some Republican constituencies. And Reagan would not have embraced this craziness among Republicans.
I'll do you one more on the left, Tulsi Gabbard. The left destroyed that woman, and the right was willing to work with her and talk with her. And I think she was partly destroyed because she was willing to talk with the right. Mm-hmm. And so they got rid of her. They're like, oh, are you good at talking with the right? Well, you're gone. So trash that. The question I'm asking is, a lot of people have said, oh, here's how we fix polarization. You need to have a meaningful confrontation, not a meaningful confrontation, a meaningful interaction and dialogue with someone from the other side. And I said, okay, so looking at this landslide election map, if I'm in a hardcore blue area and I go talk to a Republican in my hardcore blue election county that always votes blue for the last 30 years, that's just as good as talking to a Republican in a Kentucky district that always votes hardcore red for the last 30 years? Or am I going to get a different feel? What I'm going off of is my stepdad voted for Trump. I don't like Trump. Neither does my mom. He doesn't approve of his messaging. What he did it for was taxes. At the same time, he's married to my mom, who's Mexican. I'm Mexican. His best friend's Mexican. And we've had 8 maids who came here as illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, and he has helped all of them become full citizens. Not your typical hardcore red Republican behavior.
Right.
I'm supposed to believe that when I talk to him about gay rights and abortion access, his opinion's going to be exactly the same as a Republican who lives in hardcore Kentucky surrounded with hardcore Republicans, even though He's a Republican and lives with mostly liberals. Does that make sense?
A few final thoughts here to wrap up our interview. A lot of those attitudes that we've talked about that people hold are extremely reductive. Human beings are very complex in their thinking and priorities. For most people, politics is an acquired taste. They go about their busy lives. They're concerned about their personal situation, their jobs, their income, their living standard, their health, their family, their kids' education, their future, their potential retirement, their friends, and so forth. And politics and foreign policy are, for most of them, much less important. And their attitudes are often complex. Sometimes they'll hold a general attitude, and yet in their personal behavior, you've cited the example of, was it your dad helping out these housekeepers who were originally undocumented aliens, is a perfectly good case in point. So it's well to be wary of being too reductive in our use of terminology, and at the same time recognizing these very alarming trends in our society about political polarization, social sorting, the impact of social media on our populations, on our politics, on our economy and society. All those are factors. If I can wrap up again by returning to the subject about which I write, which is American foreign policy, I've argued in my recent book, Indispensable Nation, that it's essential for the United States to remain actively engaged in world affairs, not just as a favor to other liberal and democratic societies and allies in other countries with which we are friendly, but also if we want a more decent, less violent, less dangerous, more prosperous, more human rights abiding world. But it's also a matter of our own security, safety, and values that we remain active in world affairs. The principal obstacle to that has to do with problems in our own society. We still have the economic strength, the resources, the technology, the strength of the dollar, the economy, the population size, and all that would enable us to play a leading role. Not quite the way we did half a century ago, but still incomparable compared to others. And yet, if you think that the U.S. is irredeemably racist, as the New York Times 1619 Project claimed and is being marketed to schools as a curriculum, if you think that we are sexist, racist, imperialist, and all that, and if those are the views you imbibe as you become young members of future elites, it's very hard to imagine a country which could sustain an actively engaged foreign policy, which is not only in the interest of a decent world, but in terms of our own national security and values. And that's what concerns me, and why, as somebody who studies international relations and American foreign policy, I'm deeply attentive to these questions of American politics and society. So I appreciate you for asking me to express my thoughts about these, and for having picked up on an article I wrote nearly a decade ago.
And we read it in the Washington Post. Do you have any recommendations? I hope you found that this was a fair interview. We didn't try to set you up, put words in your mouth, and that we were fair and just trying to get information out. Is there anybody you know who might be willing to be part of an honest conversation?
I'm sure there are people I would recommend. What I can do is, if I come up with some good ideas, and you've already, looking at your list, interviewed an awful lot of people, I'd be glad to email you or call you with names and coordinates. But there are other people, I think, who are sensible about these things and who have their own views. And I'd be glad to suggest names later on.
I'll email you a copy of the video if you have any recommendations. Very last question, super quick. Here it is what we ask everybody. You're not you, you're not me. You're a third-party person who's watching this video. You don't know that person. You have no idea who they are. They watched this video. They thought it was interesting. But it's a week later. It's 5 days from now. And they're going, boy, I watched that interview. I saw a lot of stuff, bunch of material there. I can't remember it all, but there was this one thing the professor said, and boy, it's 5 days later, and I can't get that out of my head. What is that one thing you want a total random person you've never met before to not be able to forget 5 days from now, Professor?
Well, I have an answer. It may not be the one you want to hear, but it's because of I'm still in the phase of what I would call indecent book promotion. It is, I know it wasn't indecent. Sorry.
Do it.
Shameless book promotion. Any serious author, for the first 6 months or so after his or her book comes out, is going to want to do this. Or if they're not, they're making a mistake. That is, you want to tell every person, every situation, everything you interact with about your book because you think you have something to say. I think the U.S. needs to remain actively engaged in a leading role in world affairs. That for everything that's gone wrong and changed over the years, we remain the indispensable nation. And I'm concerned because acute polarization in our society has been damaging to us as Americans. It's damaged our institutions. It's damaged the way we relate to each other. It's damaged our politics, and it threatens the viability of our active role in world affairs. And I think we need to be deeply aware of it and seek to counter it to the extent that we can find ways to do so. Thank you for your questions, and thanks to everyone who is watching this for watching and listening.
We'll leave it there. Thank you, Professor. I'll email you shortly, and we really, really appreciate you coming out. Thank you, Professor.
My pleasure.